When the Baal Shem Tov introduced the idea of Chassidus to the world, it was met, as you can well imagine, with a fair amount of resistance. And the reason for that makes sense, because Jews, generally speaking, are very wary of anybody who comes along and says, well, here's a different way of doing it. We've had it happen to us enough times in our history where either they've suggested, like for example, the Sadducees, that the oral Torah has no validity, and they went off on a tangent saying, we're going to interpret the scriptures literally, and we know what happened to them, and they eventually faded completely from history. Or if it was the early chasm of Christianity, where there were Jewish people who said that they had a different interpretation of the Torah. And of course, we know where that went. And so it's been throughout the course of our history. There's a lot of suspicion in the Jewish world of anything that looks new. In fact, there's a play on words that people use. The expression goes, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, which basically means that in the agricultural cycle, until they bring the Omer offering, we're talking in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, until they would bring the Omer offering on the second day of Pesach, Chadash, all of the new produce, was Asur, was forbidden to use. So the expression goes, Chadash, the new produce, Asur Min HaTorah, the Torah forbids it. And they would use that expression, Chadash, something that is introduced in Judaism, that is new, Asur. Your first reaction is that it's probably forbidden. So always take a very wary approach. More specifically, in the time just before the Baal Shem Tov, we had the debacle of Shabtai Tzvi, who was an individual claiming to be Moshiach and also claiming to be a big Kabbalist and very charismatic personality, so many people started to follow him, and that landed in disaster as well. So by the time the Baal Shem Tov arrived and started to teach the approach of Chassidus, there was a big divide in Eastern European Jewry. Those who accepted and embraced the concept of Chassidus, and those who really pushed it away as much as possible and even sanctioned people who were involved and so on and so forth. It was a bit of a rough period of history, and that extended through the Baal Shem Tov's time and into the subsequent generations. It didn't just go away. Now, in today's world, it's quite different. In today's world, we live in a much more harmonious Jewish community, even though there is a lot of conflict in the Jewish community on all kinds of issues. But on this specific issue of the acceptance of Chassidus as a valid part of Torah and an element that people learn, regardless of what particular group they belong to, that's quite something. We've made quite a lot of progress in that regard. And so it's not unusual at all in today's world that you'll go to a yeshiva that is of a Litvish background or Mizrahi background, so on and so forth, and you'll find that people study Tanya or they invite Hasidic teachers to come in and teach. It's much more accepted across the board. So at the beginning of the Rebbe's leadership in the early 1950s, the Rebbe addressed this question of if Chassidus is so amazing, bearing in mind that in those days in the 50s, there was still this tension between the Hasidic world and the so-called Litvish world. So there was a lot of tension. So the Rebbe spoke about it. And he said, this parasha that we're going to read this Shabbos is the parasha of the giving of the Torah. And one of the principles that we have about the giving of the Torah is that any valid part of the Torah that will ever emerge through the course of history was all given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. It's just, Hashem's got like a slow release program. So certain information comes to the surface at different points in history. And interestingly enough, many of those new elements of Torah, when they are introduced, face a lot of opposition. For example, the idea of writing the Mishnah had tremendous opposition. It's the oral Torah, it's not supposed to be written. Or when the Rambam codified halacha into the 14 volumes of the Mishnah Torah, so people said, but you're supposed to learn Gemara. You're not supposed to have it so easy where you can just page through a chronological set of laws. You're supposed to argue and debate and discover and research, and that way you should come to a conclusion. So throughout the course of Jewish history, there have been many times that there's pushback against new elements of Torah that have been revealed. So this week's parasha is about the giving of the Torah, which must include every part of the Torah that is valid. So it's a good opportunity for us to speak about this question. Is Chassidus considered a valid part of the Torah? Or is it just like a nice kind of innovative perspective on the Torah and you could choose whether to embrace it or not? And I'll tell you why this is really important. Because we have a teaching, well, it's important for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is we have a teaching from the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who was this mega Kabbalist who completely revolutionized the idea and the world of Jewish mysticism. So he teaches that every single soul has a requirement to learn every single part of the Torah. And if you don't get to learn the entire Torah, then you come back again and again and again until you finish it. So it's quite important to know what's on the menu. What do we have to actually learn in order to fulfill this requirement that the soul comes into this world and studies the whole of Torah. So the Rebbe asks the following question. He says, people always say, if Chassidus is so amazing, and when we talk about the word Chassidus, it falls under a broader topic that is called Pnimius HaTorah, the esoteric part of Torah, the part of Torah that's not exactly obvious, the part of Torah that many people feel is actually dangerous. People will tell you until you're at a certain age you shouldn't learn these things, and until you have certain background knowledge you shouldn't learn these things. Even the Rambam says that. He says you have to first fill yourself with a meal before you have dessert. So in other words, you've got to know what's going on in Halacha and in Chumash and in Gemara and so on and so forth. And only then you can get into the Kabbalistic. So you can imagine people are very wary. So the question is, if Chassidus is genuine, if Pnimius HaTorah is the esoteric, the inner dimension of Torah is something that we're supposed to learn, how come they didn't do it in previous generations? Throughout the whole of our history, yes, of course, there were always little pockets, secret societies of people who were Kabbalists. Let's say, for example, during the Talmudic era, so we understand that the Talmudic era was this incredible golden age of Torah learning, where they produced so much of what is the backbone of our Judaism today. And there was a secret society. There was a group of people who simultaneously with the development of the Talmud were learning mysticism on the side, like famously Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who wrote the Zohar, and his students and various others like him. But it wasn't mainstream. And again throughout history, you'll see there's always these little pockets, secret societies. But the idea of mainstreaming Pnimius HaTorah, the esoteric part of the Torah, is not part of our history. So where does it come from? Where do you get this idea from that it's now acceptable that we should start wholesale teaching this stuff? Just to give you a perspective on it, the Baal Shem Tov did in fact release and teach and reveal the concept of Chassidus to the world. And then he had the Maggid of Mezrich, Rabbi Dov Ber, who took over from him as the next leader of the Hasidic movement. And then the Maggid of Mezrich, who was an incredible strategist, set out different Hasidic groups to move to certain parts of the world so that there would be this growth of the Hasidic movement. And each one of them had one of his students at its helm. And what's interesting about it is each of those students took a particular style and they developed a particular style. So you'll find within the spectrum of Hasidim, there are groups that have similar styles. And the one unique style was the style of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. And his style was that you take the ideas of Chassidus and you teach them not just wholesale, but with a tremendous amount of detail and a tremendous amount of rational insight. And his colleagues, who were themselves Hasidic leaders, not all of them agreed with that approach. They felt that there's a certain amount that we're allowed to teach, like just enough to keep people inspired. It was a time in history that was difficult, so many people were kind of falling off the wagon. And they felt that you just give them the basics, like spiritual first aid, in order to keep everybody connected, but you don't go into this kind of detail and produce volumes and volumes of deep, technical, thorough Hasidic texts. And there was this tension between the Alter Rebbe and his colleagues. And one particular point in time, one of those colleagues found a page of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings lying in the gutter. And he said, you see, that's what's happening over here. This is the problem. You make it available to people that don't appreciate and respect what the depth and power of this dimension of Torah is, and so they don't look after it properly, and this is what happens. And that was the thinking. So the Rebbe says, the question is, how come it is now in today's world that we seem so accepting and embracing of the concept of teaching esoteric Judaism, where in the past nobody wanted to do it? And then the question is a little bit more nuanced than that. Because one of the big differences between the approach of Chassidus, now people don't necessarily recognize this. So the reason people don't recognize this is because everybody thinks that Chassidim are the smiley, happy clapper, embracing people. There's no judgment, have a l'chaim, everybody let's join together. And it seems like it's Judaism light. That's often one of the criticisms that people have. It's Judaism light. Like, why don't you insist on people having a deeper, more committed experience of Judaism? Why do you make it so easy for them? Just put on tefillin and that's it. It's quite ironic because one of the main initial arguments against Chassidus was that it's so heavy. So it's quite ironic that today you've got the accusation that it's so light. The original accusation was it's so heavy. Why so heavy? Because one of the core teachings of Chassidus, it's a very important and a theme that runs through the whole of Chassidus, is the principle of what we call bittul. Bittul means this. If you think about it, the average person, let's say the average person who's a frum person, just whoever they might be, whichever particular group they might belong to, the average frum person feels that there's tremendous benefit in their experience of Judaism and their commitment. For example, there's nothing more beautiful than a Shabbos. Have you ever spoken to somebody who comes from a frum background and they've kept Shabbos their whole life? They'll tell you there's nothing more beautiful than a Shabbos. It's downtime, you sit with your family, you eat good food, you're social at shul, you get to experience a little bit of spirituality both in the prayers and in the study that happens on Shabbos. You're supposed to sleep on a Shabbos afternoon. I mean, when do you ever get that opportunity? It's just such a relaxed experience. The same thing with Yom Tov. Every Yom Tov is absolutely beautiful. We get together, we buy new clothing, we have special meals, we have guests, we join with our families. It's just so beautiful. And then comes along Chassidus and gives you a whole different experience. For example, Chassidus teaches that Shabbos is called in the Torah Shabbos LaHashem. It's not about you. Shabbos is a day that you're supposed to give up your personal interests, that's why you don't work, and totally focus on godliness. So what's Shabbos? Shabbos is a day to wake up earlier so that you can study extra. And Shabbos is a day that you don't have the pressure of going to work. So instead of davening as quickly as the minyan takes, you're supposed to take your time over your prayers. And you're supposed to eat, even if it means that you don't necessarily get to eat that lavish meal that everybody else has on Shabbos. And sleep. How could you sleep on Shabbos? It's such a holy day. It's a time, so it's a completely different kind of an experience. And that's called bittul. Bittul means the surrender of your own interests. So many people are inspired in their Judaism because of their interests. Because if I follow the mitzvahs, I'm going to have brachas. Because if I do these things, it will give me peace of mind. Because the mitzvahs that I do here will be an investment for a portion in the world to come. So there's I see personal value in it. And one of the great arguments that people had against Chassidus is, why are you now teaching an approach that says, relinquish the sense of what you want to get out of things, and just be committed to Hashem almost blindly? It doesn't seem like it's an easy or even a fair kind of an approach. So those are the two major questions that were leveled against Chassidim, and it's those two that we have to address over the next few days, please God.